What's up, everyone? Thralls Metal here once again. I'm the Croc Nick, and doing another list here. I had a lot of fun going through all the stuff that I went through in my teens, that whole list of 20 albums that I did, and I decided it'd be kind of fun to go through my early 20s and then late 20s a little bit later in a separate video, because I got into a lot of different stuff in my 20s, and definitely some new sounds caught my ears, and the musical landscape was changing around then too, so there were some new styles that came about, and then I got into some older stuff too. So I figured, why not? It's kind of an interesting subject, and your tastes change as you get older, and this definitely showcased it. So let's start here. Slipknot, self-titled. Now, I know Jam & John brought this one up in his teens. I'm a little bit older, so I got into this in my 20s. And just going to preface this with saying, yeah, I was kind of into the new metal thing early on, but it really didn't have the tremendous impact as all the earlier music I was listening to, so I really didn't get into it very much. But I had to bring up this one because this was a bit of a game changer for me. I've been listening to like Korn, Deftones, Cold Chamber. I still like a lot of those bands, namely Deftones, but when Slipknot came about, it was different. It was more extreme. They brought back elements that were in like death metal again, and grindcore, and thrash metal. You know, the drumming was way more intense, the vocals were way more harsh, there was a distinct energy to it that was kind of old school in a way. I mean, I would honestly say that this album right here and their follow-up, Iowa, kind of helped kill nu metal in a way, because it just was changing, it was becoming more extreme, and it started not fitting in that whole da-dun, da-dun, you know, that repetitive Korn riff that every band wanted to throw out there. And granted, yeah, there were some rap vocals in here, but the delivery when it came down to the screams and the growls was notably harsher, and you had big, chuggy guitars again. So this was kind of a reawakening in terms of me getting into heavier stuff again, because it seemed like, in comparison, a lot of the stuff I was listening to was definitely more radio-oriented. We'll call it that. But yeah, this was important, and I still like this album. It's still fun. And some of their newer stuff, not so much. There's songs here and there that I like, but for the most part, I'd much rather just return to this one and kind of relive those early 20s. So from there, the whole metalcore scene started to really gain some steam, and I started checking out bands that were similar to that. They were on Victory Records, Century Media, Nuclear Blast, and that's where I started finding more underground stuff through those labels who were kind of small at that time. And Shadows Fall of One Blood was definitely one that I picked up early on. This originally came out in 2000, I believe. This is a reissue from 2008, because my copy was just absolutely beat to shit, and they had a reissue, and I figured, why not get slightly better sound on it? Because the original recording was so-so, but this one kind of reminded me of how much I love thrash metal. Because as much as these guys got lumped into the whole metalcore pack, and yeah, there's definitely some metalcore to their sound, there's a lot of just classic thrash metal, heavy metal, speed metal, all that stuff to their sound. Ripping solos, thrashy breakdowns, you know, there was a flair for just awesome sort of 80s-ish riffs. I still love this album, and I keep hearing these guys are getting back together, which would be awesome. I would definitely go see them again, because they put on a killer live show. Again, this was sort of a reawakening to stuff that I loved early on, and I actually started revisiting some of that stuff that I loved early on and kind of dismissing the whole nu metal stuff again. Solid album if you've never jammed it. I mean, these guys were reasonably big for a time, so I'm pretty sure most people have heard of them. But if you haven't, definitely check it out. Killswitch Engage, Alive or Just Breathing. Now, this isn't my original copy. That one got played the fuck out from, you know, being in my car all the time, just jamming the shit out of it. I absolutely loved this album when it came out. This was definitely different. It had all those Shadows Fall qualities, but the melodic vocals were much more present. I just thought they really just knew how to carry a tune and write a giant chorus. And this really became like the formula for metalcore for a while, and I would say it was definitely courtesy of this album. This was definitely one of the main ones, at least. Pretty much every song on this album just had this giant hook chorus, but during the verses, it was brutal, heavy, big, giant, chuggy riffs. It kind of balanced between hardcore and metal, thus we have metalcore. And I just really still dig this album, this one in particular. I go back to the other ones every now and then. Killswitch is still kind of my wheelhouse of listening, not as much as it was, but I still really enjoy this album, and it definitely had a huge impact. I mean, again, pretty much reminding me that, you know, metal is not necessarily meant to be on the radio all the time. It's meant to be also heavy and abrasive. but it doesn't have to be without melody or a tuneful chorus. This was a really cool release at the time, and yeah, I still dig this one. The Agony Scene, self-titled. Now, again, during this whole time where metalcore started coming up, a subset of it, I guess you could say, was Christian metalcore, and I actually bought a lot of the Solid State Samplers, which is the label these guys were on initially. I didn't care that they were Christian. I'm not Christian. I've never been Christian. I've never been really religious in any sense, but I'm just looking for good music, and this album really struck me in terms of its overall sound. This one actually sounded more like melodic death metal than metalcore. Lots of At the Gates riffs, and at that time I didn't know who At the Gates was. So this was kind of an awakening to that sort of sound. Pretty much love every track on here. It's intense as hell. They pretty much skip over any sort of clean vocals. There's like brief spots, but they're really not used to any great effect. It's just sort of a change from the screams and growls that are on here. Very intense band. These guys recently resurfaced and put out a banger of a new album called Tormentor that I really enjoyed, and added some black metal elements, which was really interesting. I might do a thing about the Christian metal bands that I got into, because they were everywhere for a while. Like, different labels were throwing them out there. You had Face Down, Tooth and Nail, and all of them seemed to be just throwing out Christian-themed metal or rock bands. And I got into them for a time. But this one I always end up coming back to, because this one just felt so heavy that it couldn't be nice and Christian. I don't know. Either way, definitely check this one out. It was a lot of fun to listen to. Lamb of God, Ashes of the Wake. Now, along with metalcore, groove metal also kind of made a comeback, namely in the form of Lamb of God. They pretty much became this generation's Pantera, even though I'll argue that Pantera is still this generation's Pantera. But either way, this was their major label debut on Epic Records. I had their first two, and I liked them, but when I heard this one and heard the mix done by Machine on this, absolutely amazing. The songs were absolutely killer, very dynamic, very ranging. I loved Randy's vocal delivery. He was probably one of the first ones that I noticed he had like this really clear pronunciation when he growled. And again, this had like some of those Pantera-like riffs that I really enjoyed, but it also had some really cool thrashy parts and killer breakdowns. Chris Adler did a marvelous job on drums on this and pretty much every release they were on. He was just a solid drummer. But yeah, this was kind of in that whole metalcore pack for me. I just kind of lumped them in there, and they kind of just brought about this whole new wave of American heavy metal. There was a bunch of other bands that popped up sort of in this vein as well. But this was probably the big one, and this album really did break big, and then Sacrament broke even bigger. But, I mean, I still return to this one quite a bit just because there's a lot of fun riffs on here. I have hope for the new album. I don't know, the two tracks I've heard have been, okay, but I will always return to this one because it's still just a buttload of fun to listen to. Mastodon Remission. This one I discovered courtesy of samplers. And when I was in my 20s, in the early 2000s, samplers were everywhere for pretty much every label. If you had a label that had heavy music, there's a good chance you were putting out like an annual sampler at least. And Relapse Records had the Contamination series. And I heard March of the Fire Ants on it, and that song absolutely blew me away. I really heard nothing that was that sludgy before. Unlike Jam and John, I hadn't listened to Crowbar to any great extent. I just knew them as the guy with the kind of grimacing face that was on Beavis and Butthead when they were making fun of videos. That was about it. Mastodon kind of introduced me to that whole sludgy sound, but there was also a really cool melody, and I never quite heard drum work like Braun's. Braun Daler is a fantastic drummer. Like, the amount of fills and just crazy rhythms this guy came up with really became like a huge part of their sound. And this one definitely made me want to go back and listen to like Melvin's albums again, which I didn't bring up in the teens ones, but you know, I plan on returning to that at some point. But this was definitely another game changer. I've been a huge Mastodon fan since. They really haven't misfired, at least in my mind. And I think this was their first true great album. Like, this one really just launched them out of the gates, and they were fucking flying. Kind of hard to avoid Mastodon these days, so I'm reasonably sure pretty much everyone's listened to this one before. But if you haven't, of course, there's links to all the music down below in the description. So, yeah, definitely check out Mastodon if you've never heard of them. And if you have, check them out again. They're still fucking awesome. In Flames, Reroute to Remain. Now, as I was getting into the whole metalcore scene, I kept hearing about melodic death metal bands. Like, that was a style that people kept talking about, and I would actually see like show up as a legit genre. So I had never really heard any of these bands, but In Flames was one that was constantly mentioned, especially when it came down to Killswitch Engage. They said, oh yeah, these guys jock In Flames all the time. So on a whim, I picked up one of their albums, and at the time, it was 2002, this was their newest one. I figured, well, let's see what they got right now. And I picked this one up, and I definitely heard the comparison. Now, this isn't my favorite one. It's just the one that sort of launched me into In Flames. I went out and got fucking everything I could because at the time I really liked this album. Going back, it's an okay album. But what I got into was the fact that this was a different approach to death metal. Like, it still had all the hallmarks of death metal, the harsher vocals, except they were up in a higher range, which I hadn't really heard before. Most of the death metal vocals I heard were like Florida scene stuff, so it was generally down as a low roar. This was more of a higher shriek, and then occasionally you would get clean vocals, which were pretty much unheard of in death metal, you know, in terms of like the Florida style, or even New York with like Suffocation and shit. The melodies were really distinct, and I really just enjoyed the overall sound. It was a different approach, and from here, I would start getting into more melodic death metal, which there's definitely plenty for me to talk about here. If you're jamming this one, it's a pretty decent album. Not their best by quite a bit, but I do like it better than what they're doing now. Sorry, I'm just not a fan of what In Flames does now, but yeah, that's just me. Either way, check it out. Soilwork, A Predator's Portrait. Now, along the same time, this was a band that I heard about as well that was associated with In Flames. In fact, they often toured together and such. Now, the first time I remember hearing these guys, it was on one of those cable music channels. Like, if you went past a certain point on the channels, they'd have different themed music channels that didn't have any videos or anything. It would just show you, like, a piece of artwork or a picture of the band and say what track they're playing. And I remember hearing, I believe, Bastard Chain on one of these cable channels. It's the opening track on this album. And at that point, it was like, huh, that's kind of similar to that In Flames band. And I went out and picked up this album, and I think I also picked up Natural Born Chaos around the same time. But I wanted to talk about this one because that was really the first song I heard was off this album. And I really love this album still. It's very thrashy. These guys included a lot more in the way of keyboards, and the clean vocals are a lot better. Their frontman, Speed, I think it's Bjorn something, I can't pronounce his name right, I'll probably screw it up, is an exceptional vocalist. He does great harsh vocals, and he's an excellent singer. I've seen these guys 3 times now, and he is spot on, like, every time. I really like the fact that the melodic sections really were, I think, a lot stronger than on In Flames when it came down to the clean vocals, but they had those same kind of riffs, those melodic death metal riffs that are just very distinct. And absolutely love this album. Needle Faced is one of my favorite songs on here, and Neurotica Rampage. Those songs are both just fast, nasty, aggressive, and they have a little bit of a thrashy edge to them, which I really got into. But yeah, Soilwork is still up there with one of my favorite melodic death metal bands, and I became a fan right from here. At the Gates, Slaughter of the Soul. Now, this was the one that I finally got hip to, like after listening to In Flames and Soilwork. At the Gates were almost always in the conversation in terms of, like, if I brought up, oh, I listen to In Flames and Soilwork and shit. You ever listen to At the Gates? It's like, no, I haven't. I feel like a loser now. Because these guys were really the ones that cemented the sound. And this originally came out in 95. But I didn't pick up on it until probably about 2002 when they were reissuing it. And this has been reissued so many times. I think it's like the 3rd reissue I have of the album. But as soon as I jammed this, I realized it had those same riffs. In fact, I would say they're even better than, you know, those other albums, just because these are the ones that really laid that foundation. And it was a lot more intense. I think the fact that there are no clean vocals on here really made it feel more metal, more abrasive. And mother of God, these songs are so fucking catchy. Like, this whole album is absolutely incredible from start to finish. It's a classic for a reason. And I was just kind of late to it. But, I mean, this is absolute fucking metal royalty, in my opinion. And still one I jam frequently. But yeah, this definitely cemented that melodic death metal was going to be a thing for me. And pretty much this is a super influential album. You can literally pick up almost any melodic death metal album, and they're going to have a little bit of At the Gates to them. The Haunted, One Kill Wonder. Now, after listening to At the Gates, I realized that when they broke up, there was a subsequent band that formed after them called The Haunted. And this was actually out at the time when I was picking up stuff. Like around 2002, I was really fucking busy picking up melodic death metal and shit. And I picked this one up, and man, this is a fucking heavy album. I absolutely love The Haunted. Still a big fan. Yeah, they've had some missteps in the past, but this is probably one of their best albums. And I like the fact that they didn't just solely rely on just that at-the-gate sound. They brought in a lot of thrash elements, even a little bit of hardcore, because at this point they had Marco as their frontman, who is their current frontman now, and his delivery had kind of a straight hardcore bark and maybe like a little bit of thrash to it too. So it kind of really worked, kind of melding this sound all together. And this came out with some like killer singles. I mean, DOA was on Rock Band as their earache thrash package. And I absolutely love the title track on here. It is one of the most aggressive, fast songs on here. Shithead's awesome too, which that's a hilarious name for a serious metal song, but my god. This album is killer, and the guys from At the Gates really just said, we're not quitting yet, we're just going to keep going with this shit. This album showed me that there was a little bit of variance in melodic death metal. Sometimes you could approach it from a little bit more of a thrash metal perspective, and sometimes you can take it more from the death metal side, but I think the big thing was riffs and melodies and big catchy choruses. Now, while this didn't have any clean vocals, these guys had fucking hooks all throughout this album. Definitely check it out if you've never heard it. Entombed, Left Hand Path. Now, while looking around at all things Sweden, because at this point I was pretty much obsessed with that wonderful metal country, I came across Entombed, and I thought this was going to be another melodic death metal album. Really didn't have any reason to think it wouldn't be, just because, like, oh, Sweden, that's what they do. Not true. This is the Stockholm scene, not the Gothenburg scene, and I didn't know that, and what I was greeted to was quite possibly the nastiest guitar tone ever. I love the buzzsaw tone, and this is where that comes from. Again, I thought it was going to be melodic death metal, and it turned out to be something quite possibly even more wonderful, because I go after HM2 bands, or HM1, I forget which one it is, but I go after those bands that have that buzzsaw Swedish tone. So if it sounds like Entombed or Dismember, there's a good chance I'll probably like it. This album is probably up there with one of my favorite death metal albums of all time. Like, it could be top 10. But again, this was like another awakening to another style within death metal that was notably different. There was more D-beat sounds in there, like more of a punk sort of attitude. And of course, I loved all the horror themes, and this album cover is just fucking sick. Love this album to death. Still play it all the fucking time. If you've never heard this, this is death metal royalty, at least in my opinion. Definitely a game changer as far as what I listen to. Meshuggah, Destroy, Erase, Improve. Once again, I saw that they were Swedish. I saw they were on Nuclear Blast Records, which I had been buying a lot of stuff from them, so I went after it. And then when I listened to it, I initially didn't like this, because I had never heard polyrhythms like that before. Like, it was confusing. Like, I didn't know how to process these rhythms, and how the vocal cadences didn't necessarily follow a certain part here or there. It was just confusing. It sounded like a mess to me initially. But I knew it was a challenging listen, so I kept at it. I kept listening to it. And the more I listened to it, the more I got into it. This album is absolutely amazing. This is actually, I would say, a game changer in music. Because before this, they were more of like just kind of a technical thrash band. And then with the Nun EP, they started bringing in more breakdowns with more groove to them. But this is the one where they really started bringing in the polyrhythms. And for the casual listener, I think shit got confusing. It did for me. And this isn't my original copy. That one got worn the fuck out for me listening so much. And this is a reissue from 2008. But I absolutely love this album. And this got me into more technical metal. I really hadn't listened to anything quite like that before. And after this, I started getting into all sorts of crazy stuff like Cynic, Dillinger Escape Plan, because this really kind of opened the door for me that, again, there was more to metal than I thought there was. Amazing album. Definitely check it out. Black Dahlia Murder, Unhallowed. So, I heard about this band from Detroit that got signed to Metal Blade Records, Black Dahlia Murder, and I heard that they were a melodic death metal band. Like, ooh, okay, I'll check that out. Now, when I played this album, I realized this was a much more aggressive style of melodic death metal. This included blast beats and more straight death metal chugs. What these guys did was pretty remarkable in the sense they took pretty much that Florida sound, like that straight up thrashy death metal that we have here in the States, and then combined it with the Gothenburg sound with the melodic death metal riffs. and really kind of created their own little take on melodic death metal. These songs had really melodic hooks, but they also favored straight up harsh vocals, and Trevor's high and low register bouncing back and forth was just crazy sounding at the time. I really hadn't heard anyone do that as well or so distinctly at this point. And again, while these guys were just blasting along, there were really catchy riffs going on. Another thing they did that's kind of prevalent in melodic death metal, instead of playing like flashy, squealy solos, they were playing lead melodies rather. And it just kind of like enhancing the song but not get too intricate. That was kind of a thing that these guys did as well. And I thought it was cool that this band was American, but they were playing this style that was distinctly Swedish, but again, doing their own take on it, which was really cool. Been a fan of these guys pretty much ever since this album. Definitely albums I like more than this one, but this one's still a lot of fun. And honestly, I don't think they really have a bad album in their discography. I mean, we'll see when we eventually rank them, because that's probably going to happen at some point. But yeah, definitely check them out. Check out their new album too. Check out all their fucking albums. They're fucking great. Emperor in the Nightside Eclipse. Also during this time, I discovered black metal. To me, black metal really didn't have any bearing on my tastes. It was just something I would see in metal mags. I'd just see these guys in the corpse paint and shit, like, I don't know if I'm ready for that. And as I got older, got a little bit more adventurous, and I remembered on one of the samplers that I had from Century Media, I think it was Identity 2, I believe the last track on it was from Emperor. The song was Inno a Satana. And I remember jamming that when I was like, well, this isn't what I really thought it'd be, because I thought it would just be like lo-fi squealing and all that. And it was really melodic. It was really well written. There was a lot of clever melodies throughout. And it was very atmospheric in the sense they had like keyboards really layering it well. So I went out and found this album, picked it up, and jammed the whole thing. And this is one of my favorite black metal albums. When I compared them to the other black metal I started getting into, these guys seemed like they had a clear edge in terms of just musicality over some of them. All those other bands were good too, like I love Dark Throne, I love Mayhem, Marduk, all those bands. But these guys sounded notably different. There was more melody, the songwriting was more intricate, and I had no idea Isan was such an amazing songwriter. This was a huge game changer for me. This was probably my first black metal album, honestly. And this definitely opened the door for black metal. I probably brought it up in our What Got Us Into Black Metal video we did fucking forever ago, but this one was absolutely huge for me. Immortal, Sons of Northern Darkness. So in my continued pursuit of more things black metal, I saw this cover, and pretty much I knew there was no way this wasn't black metal, just judging by that cover. I had no idea I would stumble onto probably one of my favorite black metal bands as well. I love Immortal. I have pretty much their entire discography, but it all started with this one. I love the fact that these guys were fiercely melodic. Abath had a very signature style of writing at this point, and he was very melody forward, but it never really skimped on the brutality, and I love his vocals. It almost sounds like the Wishmaster guy from all the Wishmaster movies, the Jinn or whatever. I love his delivery. I love the atmosphere. It feels very cold, but it's also very epic. This is a killer album. I don't know if it's my favorite Immortal album, but it would definitely be up there, and it has a lot of nostalgic appeal because I listened to the shit out of this when it came out. I absolutely love this record, and I strongly recommend anyone that hasn't heard it, just check this one out because it's just a lot of fun. Fucking riffs, man. Fucking riffs. Satyricon, Nemesis, Divina. Once again, pretty much looking up different bands and such in terms of black metal because this was something I was really getting into. This was a name that often came up. Now, I believe it was Rebel Extravaganza that was coming out at the time or out at that time, but I saw this one on the rack and I just loved the cover and I picked it up, and again, I might have just found one of my favorite black metal albums. This is an incredible album. This one felt decidedly more evil than Immortal or Emperor, actually. Like, Emperor had an epic thing, so did Immortal. This felt just evil and raw and just brimming with all things Satan. It was fucking awesome. I became a huge Satyricon fan after that. I pretty much went out and got pretty much everything I could find. I think I'm still missing their first album. And, looking for stuff on CD that's out of print could be a little bit rough. But this album was another one that absolutely cemented me as a black metal fan. I didn't bring it up in the original black metal video we did, but it was kind of limited to 10, and I had some other ones that were kind of a little bit further along the line that at the time I thought were more important, but going back and listening to this one, I was like, no, I remember exactly how I felt listening to this one. I was like, dude, yes. Check it out if you've never heard it. It's fucking amazing. Dying Fetus, Stop at Nothing. Now, another thing that I picked up on those wonderful Contaminated compilations, courtesy of Relapse, was Dying Fetus. I had never heard a precise and brutal band like them. Now, Suffocation was very close to these guys, but it was different. The breakdowns were a little bit different. These were just punchier. And John Gallagher's low burped vocals just seemed to echo with me. I don't know why, but I just really fell in love with the sound. These guys always have riffs for you, and the drum work is always on point. As brutal as these guys are, they always have riffs for you. There's tons of them on here. And pretty much those brutal death metal breakdowns are just fucking sick on this album. Now, I went out and got all their other stuff after that because I just absolutely loved the sound. It was ridiculously heavy. Like, I may have approached a level of heavy and death metal that I hadn't heard before. And I'm still a giant fan of this band. I really don't get into slam much, but when it comes down to stuff that's close, like brutal death metal, this shit. Not necessarily my favorite album, because, man, they put out a lot of fucking killer albums, but this one definitely got the ball rolling. Nile, In Their Darkened Shrines. Yet another one I got into courtesy of the Contaminated series when I heard these tracks on there. This was probably my earliest exposure to technical death metal, not just like techie like Meshuggah, but technical death metal in terms of the songwriting on here is just insane. And the drum work on here is absolutely nuts. It was something I really had not heard someone drum that fast before. Like, I thought Deicide was fast as shit, and they are, but Nile was something else. And another thing that I really loved about this, that I really hadn't heard on a lot of other albums, was how committed to a theme they were and the atmosphere that worked with it. This was my first Nile album, and it was pretty much, I need to get everything Nile after that because I really just dug this. These guys had a really cool theme that seemed very unique to them, and everything seemed very theatrical, but it never sacrificed any of the brutality, like, ever. These guys were brutal as fuck all the fucking time. And I still love them. Hopefully I get to see them on tour again whenever concerts resume. But yeah, this is what started it all for me there. Rotten Sound, Exit. So for a little while I got out of grindcore, but I stumbled upon this band in a used bin and I decided to pick it up. And as soon as I heard the sound, it definitely reminded me of how nasty grindcore could be. Like, but it was different though. It had that almost Swedish tone to it, which at that point I had definitely been immersing myself in, courtesy of Entombed. And it was a different approach than, say, like Brutal Truth or Napalm Death. It seemed more aggressive, surprisingly. Like, it was so in your face and fast at all times that I just couldn't believe it. They didn't get, like, kind of crazy and weird like Brutal Truth did. It was just heavy, fast, and in your face, and just disgusting. I absolutely love this album. I love Rotten Sound. I missed a chance to see him, like, a few years ago. I'm still kicking myself over that. Hopefully I get a chance to see him soon. This is an absolutely kick-ass album, and yeah, I mean, that's pretty much all I got on it. It's fucking Rotten Sound rules. And then finally we have Candlemass, Tales of Creation. This was honestly my first exposure to doom metal. I've been listening to stoner metal and such, like Caius, Queens of the Stone Age, Fu Manchu, stuff like that. And I always heard the term doom metal, but I never quite understood what it was. Like, oh, they're just talking about, like, death metal, but they just fucked the word up. No, it was an actual style, and I was just an idiot fucking kid. Go figure. But when I heard this, I got it. I got what that sound was. Like, it's definitely built on a feeling, like it's foreboding, and it sounds evil and occultish, but surprisingly melodic. And I'm glad I started here because Candlemass is still one of my favorite doom metal bands, and I got to hear Messiah do his amazing operatic vocals. And at that time I was kind of like, singers in metal are kind of whatever, but when I heard this guy, like, his remarkable control, I just absolutely fell in love with the sound. And plus he was doing it over, like, a heavier tone. Like, this is a very heavy album. Dark Reflections is one of my favorite tracks on here, and the chug on that is ridiculous. This is an amazing band. I don't really need to say much about them. Everyone fucking knows who they are. But yeah, I fucking got into doom metal courtesy of this. I started buying up like Saint Vitus and like Death Doom stuff. I started getting into more. This was pretty much the catalyst for it, because at that point I was like, no, it has to be fast at all times. Like, no, it can slow down and build atmosphere and build a mood. And if you're doing it right, you might come out sounding like these guys. So yeah, that is 20 albums I got into in my 20s. Now, I made this my early 20s because I kind of want to do the late 20s separate, because I got into some different shit then too. So this is pretty much, I think I stopped around like 24 here. And if I did the math right, that's somewhere around like 2003. I don't know, I'm old, I forget shit. But again, this was fun, and I really just enjoyed kind of going back and seeing how my tastes have changed over time, and what albums really stuck out with me as super influential, and the ones that still influence the stuff I like and what I generally pick up. I'm curious if anyone out there wants to do a response video to this. I'd like to see this one carry on too, because I think it's kind of a fun idea. Unless you're already in your 20s and you're still kind of navigating that area. But at the same time, hell, just show me what you listen to. It's cool to talk about music anyway, right? Anyway, if you like the video, give it a thumbs up. And if you are new to the channel, subscribe, because we do shit like this all the time. Catch you guys later.